Okay, thanks everyone for joining the first sync for all the catalog specific topics. So I have put everything in the so initially I did put all the proposals into the sync note since this is the first meeting, and then I did a triage in this morning, and I created all the GitHub issues for all the topics that don't have a GitHub proposal yet, and also I removed some of the topics here because I think there are currently 5 topics that are being actively discussed. The other ones are kind of just floating around that we can find some other time to discuss. So for the logistics of this meeting, as I said in the dev list, seems like there are lots of topics we have to discuss right now. So I'm scheduling this to weekly for now. And once we have triaged most of the topics, we can put that into a bi-weekly or tri-weekly cadence. So for the order of discussion, I just put it in the order I think seems to be corresponding to the order in the dev list discussions. So we have the server-side capabilities, and then the security issues and OS endpoints, and the RFC process, and then pre-planned plan table, and then the securable objects discussions. And if we don't have any further comments, let's just jump into the discussions. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to make a quick comment, since I think we have a lot of people here who haven't joined previously, that this discussion is largely to drive alignment. It's not to actually make decisions. So decisions aren't actually made here. We take the output of these kind of meetings and we bring them to the dev list, because there's a lot of people in different time zones that are out on vacation, and they need to be able to contribute to the discussion as well. So we just need to be careful about that. You can't use that, oh, well, we said this in this meeting, as an argument to like knock down people's discussion on the actual dev list. So just kind of, making sure that we're involving the entire community. And I think, JB, did you have something to say?
No, that's all right. Exactly the comment that I wanted to say. So yeah, just a discussion for some kind of details, and then we go on the dev list. I agree.
Okay, sounds good. So I guess let's jump to the first topic about the server-side capabilities. So is Edward here or not? Let me check.
He's not.
Okay.
I just pinged him, and I don't know if he said maybe. We can talk about it a little bit. Unfortunately, like this is one of those ones that I think is a precursor to a lot of the other ones, because we want to make sure that we can express the capabilities before we start getting the other ones in. But
so I guess just to set up the context a little bit, what are we trying to achieve in this capabilities proposal? I think we started with not noticing that after we introduced the Vue APIs, we don't have a good way to describe that some catalog supports Vue, some catalog doesn't support Vue, and that inspired us to create some sort of notion of capability that the catalog should be able to express. And I think the discussion in the dev list seems to be in 2 topics. The first one is, what is the nuance of the capability that we should describe by the server? And then how do we describe that, right? And for the first topic, seems like the consensus is around using tags, but I'm still not very sure, like, well, what is the granularity we are looking at here? Like, how do we define the boundary of the tags if we go with that approach? Does anyone want to talk about that?
Well, can I just add a little bit to the original part? Was like, hey, what was the motivation for adding this? Because you're exactly right. Like the first instance that we ran into was the case where it's like in Spark, you have kind of 2 catalog implementations. You have the table catalog and you have the view catalog. I think that in Trino, it's very similar, where you have both like a series of operations for tables, series operations for views. And if the client doesn't know what the server is going to implement, it'll go and it'll say like, oh, list tables and then list views. And if it fails on list views, it's unclear, is that because I didn't have access, or is that because it doesn't actually support that operation? So it's like a series of capabilities where you may need to make those calls, and then the results you get back may not be clear as to why it's not supported. And the reason for that is, for server implementations, they may return 403 as opposed to like 404. And then you don't know, oh, is it because I'm access denied because of authorization, or is it because they're actually not revealing endpoints that aren't supported? Tyler?
Sorry, that was actually my question. Of like,
yeah,
isn't there provision for this in HTTP of saying unsupported versus
There is, but for good security practice, like, you don't want to reveal endpoints that you don't actually support. So typically you return 403, and then it's ambiguous whether it's because of access denied or because it's not supported. And then you can't really give feedback to the client that's appropriate. And then the other piece is like some of these other ones that are proposed, like the pre-plan, the client needs to know if it should be calling those endpoints in order to plan a table scan. If it has the ability to do that. But again, like, you run into the same situation. It's like, I get 403 back. Is that because it's not implemented, or is that because I don't have access to actually read that table? And then you go through another series. And so it's kind of like, the way that we framed it originally was, we've got these distinct capabilities, and we just need to know, like, hey, does the server support that or not? And then the alternative, which I think what Jack was getting to, is like much more fine grained, like individual endpoints. Like, hey, does this server have this endpoint or not?
I think the individual endpoint is inspired by the discussions we had with many customers, that what they really want is just very specific endpoints in the REST catalog. For example, just read. And I gave in the dev list, I think a good example is actually the Databricks uniform support, that they only give a handful of APIs for reading tables. And we actually expect many customers are going to go with a similar approach, because they just want a way to connect to open engines and be able to read their data. That's the main focus, right? And if you ask them to do like a full table or full views APIs, then it feels like a lot for them to implement.
I don't think that the tags was intended to be that, like, you have to implement everything if you return that tag. So if you have tables and you return, hey, this catalog supports tables, it would generally be reasonable to assume that they have like list and they have load, right? I'm not sure how much value there is in a catalog that doesn't have a list option. So you can't read anything, but maybe you can write to a table and you can't read. So I think from a client perspective, it's like, it knows what things it can interrogate against the server. And if the server returns something that's like, hey, access denied or doesn't exist, whatever the server wants to send back as a response, that's still within the scope of like what would happen in an interaction with tables. You're right. It definitely doesn't get to the specificity of, hey, this specific thing is implemented. And if we want to get to that level, I actually kind of like Micah's approach, which is, hey, if a server wants fine-grained, representation of what it actually supports, just have them publish an open API spec of what specific endpoints they actually have. And that way you have a standardized approach for the specific enumerated endpoints. And then you have kind of a more general client-friendly approach for generalized clients that are just like, hey, I know how to deal with tables. I don't know how to deal with views.
So someone's raising hand.
Rahil?
Yeah, I just have a question, which is like, is there a set of capabilities that at minimum we want servers to support, or is this really
Get
like
config.
servers to? Pardon?
Get config is probably the only one.
Okay.
A lot of the other ones might be kind of confusing if you don't support tables, or at least like some amount of like namespace operations. But, I guess you could always come up with a scenario where it's like, hey, like, you can write to a table that doesn't exist and the server will take care of it or something like that. But I agree, like, config is probably the one that should be required, even if it just returns nothing, as like the default of what is kind of current with today's behavior. And then it's a matter of like, well, what are the backwards compatibility assumptions? I think tables is the only one that we currently would point out there, because anything else would break things.
Yeah,
So-
but seconding on backwards compatibility, the current PR states tables. I think letting a client that doesn't get a capabilities array back assume that the catalog only supports tables is probably wrong. So the backwards compatibility story is, in my opinion, not good at the moment. I mean, we could say, okay, we assume that everything that the current spec states is there, and if it fails, it fails. If the server expresses capabilities, then we can definitely say, okay, that exists and that does not exist. But if there's nothing, well, what should a client assume? A client can, at that point, just basically guess and try.
I think this is actually one point we need to clarify here. Are we designing this for the next spec version that is going to be like people need to upgrade to not Pico, but like all the catalog implementations need to upgrade to that? Or do we still consider backwards compatibility for things that are already happening now in the current spec?
I think we want to address the current spec. Like the way that the evolution for the REST spec seems to be heading is more, hey, we add these specific sets of endpoints to achieve some functionality, but it doesn't necessarily mean like the whole spec moves forward in kind of the incremental model like we have for the table specification. And the reason being, like, you can have a fully functional REST catalog and implement one or the other without need. So you can have one that does pre-plan but doesn't do views, So it's kind of an a la carte approach, as opposed to you have to kind of like work through in a series of sequence versions, and you have to implement everything along the way. So I think that we want to take that incremental approach. I agree with what Robert is saying. Backwards compatibility story is probably a little hard, but we should probably shelve that and just figure out like, hey, what do we want to do? And then figure out, can we fit that into some sort of story around backwards compatibility?
Actually, and also to get back to Jack's original question, is like, do we design it for this version or V2, V3, whatever? Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean that's what I want to say. Is like, we can probably only design it for now for the current version, because the next version could be completely different. I mean, at least in theory. What could be maybe make sense is to add one field to the config endpoint saying, okay, I'm supporting REST API version 1, 2, 3, 42, whatever.
Yeah, I think that that's reasonable as well. Or, I mean, again, like that overlaps with the capabilities, because like if we have capabilities and we have versions for the capabilities, do you version the?
Oh no, I'm saying capabilities, because capabilities could be something like, hey, I'm supporting views, I'm supporting UDFs or something. API version is something on the REST layer. Right. So I support REST API v1, which has tables endpoints and views endpoint, but there might be a REST API version v2 that has just one endpoint, but can list tables and views together.
So I think we should probably just focus on this version. I think there's a lot of speculation about like, hey, well, what would a V2 version of the REST spec include? But I do think that if
I'm not proposing, I'm just saying.
Okay. Yeah, if we want to make that distinction, I think it's reasonable that like, hey, in the config object, you have a top level, like, hey, which spec, version. We're still at like kind of V1, but it's not even declared a version number, because that's more about like, hey, what did we put in the pathing, as opposed to like the overall spec has a version number associated with it. Unless there is in the description somewhere that I missed.
Yeah, I think it's exactly what we did for the JDBC catalog and the schema version. So makes sense to do something similar for the REST catalog. Like we support the REST spec, V1, V2, V3, whatever. I think that makes sense on the config endpoint.
But getting back to the capabilities thing and the question about that. So Jack, I think the question is like, hey, if we want specificity about like what the server actually implements, is there an issue with just having them say like, publish an open API spec if you just want to like interrogate specific endpoints, and then a client can use that, or they can reference that in whatever implementation. But then for generalized clients, bundling it as capabilities and versioning those capabilities so that, you can, from a client perspective, you think about these as groups of capabilities, as opposed to building something that like interprets some, every endpoint versioned kind of payload and then having to work with that.
So if we go with this approach, in my mind, that basically means, so first of all, does that mean the capabilities are around endpoints, or does it go beyond like small features? Like I think in the original proposals, there is even a pagination feature in the endpoint. Do we go even into that level of details?
Since like that's an example where it's like, I don't think you would need to, because it's backwards compatible, right?
No, I mean, I cannot think of it as not incompatible, but suppose there is something. Does that mean we also get into that details? Or because currently the main goal of this is to distinguish what endpoint is supported or not, right? So it seems like we are limiting that right now to that level feature, right?
Well, if you look at like what Robert proposed, I think that addresses it, where it's like, hey, I have this capability, and if we had like the example that we were using of like the paginated list operation,
right?
Say I have tables, and then if we say, okay, well, pagination addition to that tables grouping would have been 2 or 1.1, or however we do the versioning for the actual capability, then that server supports 1 for clients that only know 1, and 1.1 or 2 for clients that know how to do pagination. And you say, hey, I can support both of these things. So I feel like there's a path forward for that. I'm just trying to, and I think what everybody is saying for the other is like trying to balance every single endpoint needs to be like both enumerated in the spec and the client needs to test for all combination of endpoints that it needs in order to perform an operation, as opposed to being able to say, hey, you got tables, let's do a table operation.
And in that case, the tags are they immutable, or are they like you can still add things to the one capability going forward? Seems like it's going to be immutable, right? And we add new capabilities as we develop new features. Is that right?
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
So and the existing definitions and also definition in the future will not overlap, basically. That seems like also a requirement.
Is it like, could you have something where it's like, hey, we add a new endpoint and that's marked with tables, but it's actually tables, 4, version 4. Older clients wouldn't even know that exists, so it wouldn't ever consider making that call, and they'd only support prior versions. So I think that there might still be a path forward to evolve that, add tags to endpoints, but still, we need to be careful about that. But
okay, sounds good. I mean, I think I'm mostly convinced at this point. I don't know if there are any other comments.
I would just like to add that I think it shouldn't be just focused on endpoints, but also on things like table spec or type spec, or because the types are shared between tables and views and UDFs. And so I think we need to differentiate between the endpoints and the, say, payload specification that they support. Actually, also the vice versa. But I mean, if a client expects the server to return a table spec v4 and the server does only support v1, that's a different thing.
I think when we get into those, like especially like payload changes, like non-backward compatible payload changes, again, if we were going to change something like, hey, what does the load table actually return? That's where you version the actual URL along with versioning the table endpoint, right? Because you can't like change the payload for a specified endpoint without you wouldn't want to do that without making.
Well, I mean, you can't actually. I mean, you can't actually assume that you get a v3 table spec back if you put v3 in the URL. Assuming that thing, right?
It's more that like, hey, if I was going to change the load table payload, to return new properties that are now like required
Yes,
properties,
yes, definitely.
then we would version the URL and probably version the actual tag as well.
I mean, if you just add properties and those are like important that you shouldn't mess up and not assume anything, properties that could be expressed as a capability. But to be honest, that actually depends on the actual feature quite a bit.
Okay, any other comments regarding using tag? Okay, so to the next sub point about how do we do this? Seems like we are converging to what Robert you suggested about like having a set of versions supported, and I forgot the exact term, like also using like the latest version, something like that, right?
Yeah, a list of versions that's an endpoint, a service support. Yeah. So capabilities plus a list of versions.
I think there's probably still a discussion about like what should those specifically be, and I know that we've iterated on that a little bit. So that's something we might want to just like take to the dev list and figure out like, hey, let's get a proposal of like what those capabilities are based on what we see as potential improvements here, what we know about. Are there anything like, hey, do we want to take namespaces like we have the interfaces and separate that as a capability as opposed to just like bundling it in with tables and views or something like that. So there's probably a fair amount of discussion to go on there.
Okay, sounds good. So seems like we want to move this to the dev list. So should we proceed to the next one, which is OAuth? So Robot, do you want to go for that?
Yeah, so I haven't received, there weren't much comments on the dev mailing list and on the documents. So that's why I just started with the M1. So the PR for M1 is in the document. Yeah, it's up for review.
So I remember in the last community sync, Ryan said he has some like more fundamental comments. Daniel, do you know what exactly are those?
I did sync up with him because I know he wasn't going to be able to make this. Overall, like I don't think that there's actually a lot of disagreement about this. I think the questions come up are backwards compatibility. The things that were raised in the document about like, hey, which schemes do we actually support for security? And this is a little confusing, and I think it has to do with one, limitations of the Open API v3, because they have like a strict set of schemes they support for security, and like SIG v4 is not one of them. It's like they don't have like an HMAC or any sort of definition for that, so we can't even represent that. The other thing is the way that the way that we're using Open API is not exactly in the way that you would typically do, because we're setting this as like the standard and using this as a good way to represent what should be implemented, but typically use this to define what you have already implemented and what is supported. So when we say like OAuth 2, we're saying, hey, that is one thing that can be used, but really in the spec version of it, you're saying, I implement this thing. And I think that's where Robert gets the argument, hey, we're saying that you have to implement this thing. And what we were intending was to show that, hey, this is an optional along with SIG v4 or something else, but you can't actually represent that appropriately in the spec like this. So we kind of have two options. Like one is we note that in the description of these schemes and say, hey, this is an optional thing, and we have like default client behaviors, and this is how the client will behave if you use this this scheme for the reference implementations. The other option is we strip it out entirely. And I'm not talking about just the endpoint. Like I think we're generally okay with removing the endpoint for the reasons that you've already described. But the actual security schemes, like you could remove that entirely from the Open API spec. But then it's kind of like, well, how are we presenting to people like what the default client behavior is? Where do we document that? So I'm open to suggestions here. Like I was looking through this. The Open API like documentation around the security schemes is not particularly clear about like, hey, can you make this optional? Because it's really more about what did I already implement? Does that make sense? Check.
Is there a requirement for us to put everything in that Open API document? Because my imagination is one way you can do is, as you said, you just strip out the entire security scheme section, and then like it can be like if you imagine the REST catalog is an overall spec, and then you have like a folder for security integrations, and then in that you have a OAuth 2 integration spec and a SegWit4 spec, a Kerberos spec, all those security integrations differently. And those document all the details about how you should implement that, what are the defaults, and then you have client integrations that works with those.
I don't think there's any requirement that it has to be in there, and it may make sense to actually, like, if you can put an empty security schemes and point to where the documentation is for different things, because I think Kerberos is also not supported as far as Open API spec is concerned. But that may be a good approach, and I think that we should probably propose that as, hey, where do we actually want to document how how you implement different authorization schemes? Because it does have an impact on how the client behaves. Like the way that we did the OAuth was we set up a series of exchanges that take place, so you can leverage the server handling different operations around load table and credentials and things like that, which I think we want to continue to support, or have different strategies for how the security models work within the various endpoints, and what you can leverage from the server side. So I'm okay with that. I don't know, Amog, I think you had some thoughts around this too. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I think that's all reasonable. I think we're pretty much on the same page, because originally my concern around the removal of OAuth tokens was kind of like, the argument for that seemed to be, REST implementations may not implement it securely as per the spec, where the credentials can't be sent to the resource server directly. And to me, that didn't seem like a very good argument for removing the endpoint wholesale, because basically, if a REST server says it wants to implement that endpoint, it has to implement that correctly, which means that it can't, the credentials should be passed, it should not be passed to the resource server. So the argument that like, oh, let's remove it so that, so that we prevent people from implementing it poorly, didn't seem correct to me. But anyways, I don't think I have too much more valuable to add here. I think so far from what we discussed, I'm on the same page.
Well, just to comment shortly on that. So the OAuth spec clearly says OAuth is there to not send clear text credentials to a resource server. I mean, if you do that, then you can omit OAuth 2 entirely and just use basic authentication schemes.
It's a little inconsistent there, because it also says that while they don't generally recommend that the resource server and the authorization server are the same server, it is allowed.
Secure, there must be at least different processes. That's at least my understanding from what I've been heard from multiple security people.
I'm not sure that that's in the spec, but I don't think that that's
It's not in that spec, but that's common understanding.
Yeah. So, and then there was a question. Yeah, it's kind of nice for the client generators. This was actually a point that was made, and I'm not sure that this is in your PR either, Robert, but deprecating the definitions of the various OAuth requests and responses. I think we were probably a little overzealous, because we wanted to enumerate what those things looked like, but they're actually already defined by the RFC.
Exactly.
And we're duplicating that here. So it is convenient for people who are generating the clients, because they already have the objects to perform those exchanges.
But that limits us to OAuth 2.
Right. And well,
and bugs in there.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't think I think we probably want to deprecate those as well. So Robert, if you hadn't deprecated those, you might actually want to mark those for removal as well, because we really shouldn't be duplicating what's in
the types.
Yeah, just the request and the response types for the exchanges.
Yeah. Yeah. And for the clients, how to implement those. So the doc says, the proposal doc says, the idea is to have something pluggable, saying, okay, if a client can easily implement that. I mean, in Java, we could use whatever implementation we are offering, what we have in Nessie, because it has a lot of stuff in there already, and it's properly tested. It works with Keycloak, which the current implementation Iceberg does not support or doesn't work with. For Python, there could be other third-party libraries. So there could be there should be a proposed to have like a standard set of configuration options, but those might not all work in all languages. So that's entire. And to be honest, I think if someone writes his own Iceberg client and he doesn't only support, like, for example, SIG-v4, hey, they can go with that.
I think the question around default implementations is a deeper one. I'm not sure if that's fully covered here, but we should support default implementations for any common standard that people would use. So SIG-v4 one, an OAuth 2 one, an OIDC, if there's any differentiation that we would call out.
But then how far would you go with OAuth/OIDC? Would you say we need to support all flows? That could be a lot of work.
Yeah,
I mean, we have a lot of flows, but
yeah, there are a lot of flows. I think that, like, if you take a look,
I think that should really be up to what the client supports. I mean, Rust could be, just mentioning one language, it could be behind, while Java is most far ahead. But that shouldn't block anything. So that's why I'm saying we should keep that decision up to the implementers of the particular client / language.
But we need to make an opinionated stance for the reference implementation, which is, I think, what we would need to kind of go through and define. Like we have right now, there's a series of exchanges and flows that we use with the Java implementation. I think the Python and Rust both support that same set. So it may be a good starting point to say, hey, is this what we see as being the standard behavior for OAuth 2? If it's not, let's define what the new one is, and we can have different kind of flow strategies or something like that. But I think that we do need to actually define something, and it can't be just, hey, whatever people want to do.
I wouldn't put it as a strict requirement, but as a strong recommendation. I mean,
yeah.
If someone just wants to go with Bureau auth, hey, okay, just add the HTTP header and you're good.
Okay, so it sounds like we're mostly good on the first step, which is adding the deprecations, right?
Yep.
I'm sorry, are we also figuring out a path forward to add support for OAuth 2? I mean, it sounds like you want to define a better spec for that.
No, the proposal are actually, so for posterity, in Nessie, we have implemented OAuth 2 for a bunch of flows, including the interactive flows. And we would just propose to contribute that in whatever form. So that would be for the Java client. For Python, to be honest, I'm a Python noob. I can build something in Python, and with Rust, I would say I'm not that experienced, so I can't say a lot about that.
So this is one of the areas where, like, with the adding new support for this, I think we're open to that. Like, I don't think there's any sort of pushback to adding, new support or more expanded support for OAuth 2. The one consideration is we do have to maintain backward compatibility for behaviors until we do a V2. So, I
mean, client ID secret, Bureau token. I mean, that definitely. I mean, not stripping that out.
Yeah, so I think the main thing is, like, hey, if we add new support, that's fine. I think if we can do it in a way that people can choose, like if there is a difference in behavior, that they can choose the new behavior, or it defaults back to the old behavior, that's great. And then we can get the new functionality in, and then we can deprecate once we get to V2. I think that's.
I'm not sure whether we need to deprecate behaviors, but okay, yeah.
Yeah, because in the document it says that we're deprecating in 2 major or 1.70. So I don't know who's using OAuth 2. I don't know if we want to kind of just take them off immediately if we don't have a plan to add something better.
Oh, that you mean. So the plan is to remove the endpoint from the Iceberg spec, right? Because of some concerns and yada yada yada. And also nag the user to say, okay, if you want to use that specific endpoint, please configure it explicitly. If you implement that endpoint using the current location coordinates, do it.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, in general, we like to follow a deprecation cycle for any of these changes, and most of it's just to notify users. For the spec, it's a little different, but I think we want to follow that anyway and just go through with the release.
Okay, sounds like we can go to the next one, which is RFC process. So I think this proposal is a bit old. I think JB, you put that up a while ago, and we also have now built the proposal process for basically all the Iceberg proposals. So do we want to do a special RFC process for the spec, or do you think we just go with the like keep having different proposals and do the normal Iceberg workflows? Is JB still here?
Oh,
I think he left or dropped or whatever.
Okay.
I'm not sure that I completely understand the distinction that we're trying to make. So, I mean, the approach that was, kind of asked for clarifying, like, well, how do we actually change like a table spec? How do we change the REST spec? That, was handled a few months ago, and we added, unfortunately, it's like hidden in the documentation site, like it's down like through multiple clicks, but we have a way to actually propose changes. Is that what this is?
I think so. Because I did this with him and then I went on paternity leave. But the original intent was to do it like an official RFC process, just like many other standards like HTTP, those kind of things. So and then I realized, I think during the period I was on leave, you guys did the like a proposal process. So I don't know, are we going to just using that instead of this, or did we make any consensus on that?
So, I mean, I think the consensus was to use the improvement proposal process, which is consistent with a lot of Apache projects to use pips and sips and, things flips and everything. I guess this one is an IP, but an Iceberg improvement proposal. I don't know about switching over to RFC just because it feels like very heavyweight, especially for minor changes. And I think we even left a little bit of flexibility in the improvement proposal. If it's something really minor and there's general consensus around doing it, like adding a query param to clarify something, or adding, a property to that you don't need to necessarily go through the entire proposal process. But I think that, until we see that there's actually a problem with that, we should probably just follow that.
I see. And another point as a part of this is really how do we version this spec going forward? I think that's kind of like a unsolved question for all the specs we have right now. That seems like right now we are planning to have major versions, and do we have like minor versions or things like that, or do we just go with capabilities? Do we have a story around that?
I don't know that we actually have versions in the REST spec. Because
there's a V1 written inside that right now.
There's a V1, like all the pathing uses V1.
Yeah.
But you can actually change, you wouldn't, like if you were going to change one, like if you changed load table, you wouldn't necessarily have to go and change all the other endpoints to V2. It would just be load table as V2. And so is the spec the highest version number of any endpoint, or do we just say, no, the spec is what the spec is, and then we evolve through capabilities and versions as well as just like, the individual endpoints, and there's no like global version that we constantly increment. I don't know. I'm open. Like I don't know what people do with REST specifications like this. It seems to be like when I look at the Google ones and everything, it's just like they just enumerate what things are and what's supported.
From experience, I can say that we are quite good with just going with expressing a spec version to the client, and then the client can simply say, "Hey, okay, that's supported by the server, and that's not," and then we don't even have to version the endpoint.
Do you increment every single change?
Not every single change. Some changes are like, okay, if the client sends attribute foo bar, then we can reply with bars. If it's not the case, then we don't. Then we just omit bars.
Does it adhere to Semver?
It's not Semver at that point. It's just like, okay, the client sends that attribute, so we can safely assume that it understands the enhanced response.
Yeah, I'm just wondering because it's like you could draw a parallel where it's like, hey, if these are optional capabilities, they're minor versions, or if they're backwards compatible, they're not minor versions. If we're adding new functionality that actually breaks compatibility or would result in some sort of compatibility, like it would be a major version.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the actual change. Most changes are like, okay, we just need an attribute, so okay, here you go. Client requests that attribute, sends the constant, hey, I want to have that, and then you're good.
Yeah, I think we need to look at the implementation a little bit because there are, I think that in the Java implementation, it actually is very strict about what the call and response objects look like. So you like older versions may not even allow adding a property because it doesn't just like ignore fields that it doesn't know. We'd have to take a look at that.
Yeah, I mean, for that part, so we had a major version bump where you basically also just bumped everything to V2, everything. And I mean, at that point, it was pretty major. So there weren't a lot of changes. I mean, in the end, it really depends on what kind of change is happening. So, but for attributes, we always went for the approach to fail on unknown attributes, and with that, you can, at least on the Java side with Jackson, you can really easily get around it with saying, okay, we have JSON views, and that's basically just an empty class. It works pretty well.
Stepping back a little bit, Jack, I'm looking through this proposal. So this is, it looks like it's actually got a number of other things like adding additional endpoints.
I think that's the proposal is like a mixed bag of different things, but seems like the main intention was to do like a proper RFC process, things like that. Yeah, that dog probably doesn't map to exactly what is in the GitHub issue.
And I think what JB was doing is like he took a couple of these things and he said he was breaking them out as separate proposals. So that may be what we want to do is rather than like take this doc and try and work through it piecemeal is take, like if we want to do extra endpoints, put up a proposal, what's the justification for adding those? Like, why do we need them? And handle each one of those kind of individually.
Yeah, and going back to the version story, it seems like we want to do versioning on per endpoint. Is that right? And or is that not?
I don't know that there was any consensus. Like I think it sounds like there's the question of, do we have an overall spec doc version number that we use that we increment as changes go in?
Right. That seems to be now. And then for yeah, it depends, but it seems like there could be some criteria like if it's backwards compatible, then it doesn't increment. If it's not compatible, then it is a new version of the endpoint, things like that, right? And we can go into more nuance once we encounter those cases.
I mean, if you say something like, okay, we have say a tables capability, and as currently as v1. I mean, if you just say these capability versions are basically meaningless integer values, without any alignment to a particular Iceberg version, then you could say, okay, I'm implementing, for example, response paging, and then just label it, hey, this is also v2, and then the client can safely assume, okay, this server requires can deal with response paging.
Yeah, so there's basically potentially endpoint versioning, and then there's a general capability that can be versioned. Right?
Yeah. But you could also say, okay, I'm supporting ping tables response attribute in load table response. Then you could say, okay, I'm doing that with tables version 2, version 3, version 2, whatever.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I guess we can have a more detailed discussion to hash out all the versioning things, and seems to be a good discussion so far.
Yeah.
I think that's a good thing to take to the dev list.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And like if people know of other, other systems that are doing versioning and have a good mechanism for this, like let's look at those too. James?
Yeah, that was my general point in the chat, was just like, Kubernetes is kind of moving at great pace and seems to have a pretty good model for making version changes across a number of different endpoints, and seems to be managing that pretty well. And I just didn't know whether there are other examples like that we could maybe learn from and bring into this kind of specification. It did feel the early part of this conversation could become very, very complicated at both high-level versioning with low-level kind of very minor incremental versions that kind of come into play, and that felt very complicated to kind of really reason about. So I'm just curious if there was a commercial model that was already kind of there that we could piggyback on.
I also want to be careful that we don't like overcomplicate this. Like Kubernetes has a very vast array of APIs and things like that. Like we're talking about, I think we have a dozen endpoints at this point. So we got a long way before we're Kubernetes.
Yeah, I do but they seem to be able to move through and deprecate, making deprecations, adding minor capabilities without, working through all of those kind of nuances that I think was being discussed. And so I'm not saying like just rinse and replace, rip and replace kind of as a model, but it felt like it had some basic elements that were quite useful.
Okay. Anything else before we move to the next one?
Yeah, also just want to second that we shouldn't get into the pitfall of discussing each potential change. Because, I mean, Murphy's Law is like, okay, the first one that comes in is the one that we never discussed.
Okay, any other comments? Okay, the next one is pre-planned plan table. Okay, this one is I guess me and Rahil. I don't know. I don't think there's much to discuss here. We just need to walk through the PRs. There's potentially one point I like to bring up, which is I put on the roadmap topics, because as we start to publicly discuss this with some of our customers, like this topic keeps coming up, which is can we now use this Iceberg REST catalog to express non-Iceberg tables? Because with the pre-planned plan, you can literally like disguise a Hive table or like Delta Lake table as Iceberg table, as long as you go through, like, as long as you present a table metadata in Iceberg shape, and then you give the scan tasks in the right way, right? So I'd like to know, should we consider that keep that into consideration, or is that something that seems to be not in the scope of Iceberg project?
I'm going to go ahead and comment on that. I think that this is a big topic, and I like the idea of being able to, differentiate, or hide the complexity behind the catalog of what is actually being passed or scanned in a table scan. There's a lot of nuance to that. Across the different table formats, there's lots of different behaviors and representations and things like that. So you can, at the most basic level, I think that it would be currently possible to do some of that. As you get into more complicated things like equality deletes and positional deletes and other things, it gets much more complicated. Within the context of Iceberg, I would say it's not clear to me that we would want to take on Hoodie and Delta and everything else as a first-class citizen. That isn't to say that we wouldn't want to at least consider, like, how would we handle those things? But it's not immediately clear to me that, like, if we took that on, it wouldn't be just a giant mess of complexity.
Yeah, I don't think this is something the client side needs to take. It's more about catalog side implementations, because the biggest case that came up with this requirement, not requirement, with this ask is about people who have like a mixed bag of different formats, and they are asking if we move to this, are we able to like just keep everything as is, like they have their backend, whatever catalog thing they implement, and we add this REST middle layer, and then all of a sudden people can, like on the consumption side especially, just for reading data, they can go ahead and read using whatever Iceberg engines that can be used, right? So I would say that is at least a more on the catalog implementation side. I just don't know what is the stance from us to say, do we like advocate for that kind of use case, or it's similar. I feel it's similar to like Hadoop catalog story, right? Like, do we support, like advocate for that use case or not?
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have thoughts?
So I'm just curious as well. So like, would we be modeling then other table formats metadata inside the Iceberg REST spec? So for example, like Hoodie has its own like unique view of a timeline. Would that be like have to be modeled in the spec, or how are we thinking about like even supporting like these, like Delta or Hoodie?
See, that's where I get a little concerned. Like if we're saying the catalog can do whatever it wants, but it needs to hand back Iceberg metadata, then it's still an Iceberg spec. It's still Iceberg. And if you can represent everything you need to the client, you're still working within Iceberg. What you're doing largely is alleviating some of the constraints around, what is the actual representation behind that catalog. And I think we've talked about this before. One of the things that would actually have to change is in the table spec, we have a hard requirement for having the actual metadata file. But that is a perfect example of where the complexity comes in. Like, are there types that can't be represented properly? Are there other things in filter expressions or other things that we would put into the plan, pre, plan? I just don't know enough at this point. We haven't really done the full exploration. I think it is something that we might want to consider as an aspirational thing, but it's not clear that it's going to work just out of the box.
I think I would split it into two parts. I mean, at least logically. One part is get scan API support for tables that exist as Iceberg tables. And the other part is like, okay, which kind of, I don't want to say legacy, but they are older catalog things. How can those be integrated? I think Russell's commented on Hype could be easy. Others might not be easy. The other concern is, well, I think something to think about is what happens if a catalog runs in one data center, but the data actually lives in another data center, and then the catalog, if it's just an Iceberg table, has to get all the manifest lists from the other from the other data center on the other side of the continent just to do this get scan API. If a client would be much faster because it's much nearer to the data. So I think there's more to consider for that thing. I'm very much a fan of this thing, and I'm thinking a lot about this. And but I think there needs to be more thought about it. That's definitely true. But happy to brainstorm about it. Really.
Yeah, I have a bit of similar concerns. Like, I think it's a very cool idea, and I think we definitely should experiment with it. To Robert's point, I think actually hiding catalogs, I think that's should be fairly straightforward. And of course, some things like, for example, Glue doesn't support renames. We have to put some logic in there, but I think that should be all be manageable. My biggest concern is more about the fundamental things in Iceberg, like, for example, like field IDs and collecting the statistics and all these kind of things. These are really needed to make Iceberg work well. Yeah, and if you have existing tables in other formats, then you might have to do a lot of additional layers on top of that, I think, to make that work. I like the idea of just exposing it to Iceberg statistics. But yeah, so I think we just have to experiment there and just to see like how far that we get.
Yeah, I can talk about the experience we have done. We were able to read, when I say we, it's more about the customers we work with. They are able to read Hive and Delta pretty easily. Hoodie is a bit more complicated because of the timeline and matching the timeline thing. And there are also some other experience like doing even, sorry for the noise, doing even non-Parquet formats, but that goes into even changing the reader and writer, which is a whole more complex story.
That's probably a good stopping point. We're kind of at time.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining the initial meeting. Let's keep doing this. Seems like we have cleared lots of the questions and discussions. So see you guys next week.
Yeah, looking forward to the secureable objects thing.
Jack, are you gonna post the recording to the dev list?
Yeah, how do I do I think there's a YouTube upload, right? How do I do that?
I think that you can actually, like, once you record, it goes to Google Drive or something like that, and you can just share the Google Drive link. I believe.
Okay.
Like, it'll notify you after the fact, like once it's available, and I think give you a link to the video.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you.